Bonnie and Clyde, the most notorious couple in history and the most dangerous. They were young, reckless, and inseparable. In less than 2 years, their violent crime spree left 13 people dead, including 9 law enforcement officers. To some, they were nothing more than ruthless killers who robbed banks and filled graveyards. To others, they became folk heroes, symbols of rebellion against a system that had failed millions. This was the early 1930s, when the Great Depression gripped America in hunger, poverty, and despair. And it was out of these tough conditions that Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow rose to infamy. Their story is a tale of love, desperation, and murder that captured the imagination of a nation and secured their place as the most infamous outlaw couple in American history. This is the shocking true story of Bonnie and Clyde, America's most dangerous criminal couple. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March the 24th, 1909 in this house in the small farming community of Tellico, Ellis County, Texas. He was the 5th of 7 children born to Henry Barrow and Kumie Walker, a poor but devoutly Christian couple who worked the land as sharecroppers. Sharecropping was a system in which families farmed the land they did not own, giving a large portion of their harvest to the landowner as payment. In theory, it allowed poor farmers to make a living without capital, but in practice, it often trapped them in a cycle of debt. Many families, like the Barrows, could never quite break even, forced to borrow supplies at the start of each season, and left with little to show for their labor at the end. Clyde's childhood was marked by this struggle. The family often went without, yet Kumie held firm to her Christian principles, and Henry clung to the hope that hard work might one day deliver stability. Despite their poverty, the Barrow household was bound together by music, faith, and an almost unshakable loyalty to one another. Clyde himself showed a natural gift for music that became a lifelong obsession. His older siblings taught him basic guitar chords, and soon he was strumming out hymns and folk songs by ear. Later, he taught himself to play the saxophone, carrying it with him even in the darkest years of his life. Clyde's evenings were filled with music, practicing until his fingers hurt, hoping that one day it might carry him out of poverty. But it wasn't only music that Clyde became obsessed with. In 1916, at the age of 7, Clyde experienced a rare treat when his parents took him and his siblings to the movies. The film that was showing was The Return of Draw Egan, a silent western starring William S. Hart. While some of his family were moved by the film's dramatic ending, it was the opening sequences that left the deepest impression on young Clyde. The image of a gun-toting outlaw riding freely across the frontier and seizing wealth with a pistol in hand. From that day forward, Clyde's childhood games revolved around playing robber and bandit, reflecting a fascination that would only grow stronger. Beyond the occasional trip to the cinema, Clyde also followed the exploits of real-life outlaws through the newspapers. Stories of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and earlier legends like Jesse James filled his imagination. To Clyde, they were not criminals, but folk heroes, men who lived outside the rules of society that had offered him and his family very little. He dreamed less of becoming a farmer, a preacher, or a tradesman, and more of living the life of a bandit. But the world around him was collapsing. After the First World War ended, crop prices plummeted, and in 1918, a devastating drought struck Texas. Just 2 years later, in 1920, a plague of beetles destroyed what little remained of Henry Barrow's harvest. The family could no longer sustain themselves on the land. Forced away from farming, the Barrows joined countless others in moving to the city, seeking opportunity in Dallas's growing industrial sector. In 1921, Henry Barrow moved his family to Dallas as part of a wider migration of rural Texans seeking work in the city. They arrived in West Dallas with nothing, so poor that they spent their first months living under their wagon before saving enough to buy a tent and later building a shack. Their neighborhood was a settlement of tents, shacks, and lean-tos along the Trinity River, a place marked by poverty, disease, and crime. From here, young Clyde could look across the river toward East Dallas, where department stores glittered and wealthy families paraded in fine clothes. That daily contrast, his own surroundings of struggle and hardship, set against the prosperity of the city, planted in him both desire and resentment. During these years, Clyde fell gravely ill with a fever. With no access to proper medical care, he was left to recover in the squalor of the settlement, surviving against the odds. The illness left him permanently weakened and stunted in growth, a fact that would trouble him in later life. For 5 years, the Barrows endured these conditions. Clyde was nominally enrolled at the Cedar Valley Elementary School, but his attendance was erratic at best. He often skipped classes after dropping off his younger siblings, choosing instead to wander the streets of Dallas. He would spend hours staring into shop windows, fixated on the clothes, the cars, and the polished image of the city's elite. Each day it left him with the same feeling. He wanted that life for himself, and he hated knowing it was out of his reach. At the age of 16, Clyde Barrow began picking up work in Dallas. For $1 a day, he worked at the Brown Cracker and Candy Company at 603 Munger Avenue. He later found steadier work at Procter & Gamble, the soap manufacturer located at 1 Singleton Boulevard, earning $18 a week. In 1927, now 18 years old, Clyde moved in with his sister Nell and her first husband on Pear Street in South Dallas. From there, he took employment at the United Glass Company, situated at 334 Singleton Boulevard in West Dallas. But it was during this period that Clyde's life began to shift. He started supplementing his wages by robbing local stores and stealing cars, which he dismantled and sold off piece by piece to auto body shops. Clyde quickly developed skills in lockpicking and safe cracking, talents that gave him both confidence and notoriety in the West Dallas underworld. His earliest ventures were informal and independent, not tied to any particular gang, which suited him. Clyde had little interest in sharing the spoils of his work. By 1928, Clyde had begun working with his older brother and fellow criminal Buck Barrow, and together the two men escalated their activities. That year, they were repeatedly arrested for petty thefts and other small-time crimes. Their most memorable offense came when they stole a truckload of turkeys from a local farm, intending to sell them before Christmas. Buck accepted the responsibility for the theft and spent a week in jail, likely more concerned with sparing himself from their mother's wrath than protecting his younger brother. For Clyde, it meant a quiet holiday at home with his mother, none the wiser to what her sons had been up to. As the arrests piled up, police began referring to the brothers as the Barrow Gang. The label was premature because at this stage they were far from the organized crew that they'd later wake. But it meant that Clyde was no longer an anonymous petty thief. Police harassment became constant. Officers would visit his workplace, sometimes several times a week, to drag him in for questioning. Rarely did they have sufficient evidence to hold him, but the relentless suspicion forced Clyde to expand his automobile thefts beyond Dallas. He began working in the surrounding towns and cities near Houston, stealing cars and moving them across county lines. And despite being suspected of nearly every theft in West Dallas, Clyde managed to avoid any serious charges. That changed on November the 29th, 1929. Clyde, Book, and 4 of Buck's associates attempted to rob a jewelry store. They were caught as they tried to load the safe into a getaway car. And in the chaos that followed, Book was shot in the leg and arrested, while Clyde slipped away, hiding under a nearby house until the search died down. This incident marked a turning point. For the first time, Clyde was no longer just a nuisance to the local police. He became a wanted man, pursued by law enforcement across multiple counties. For the next 3 months, Clyde laid low in West Dallas, finding refuge at the home of a fellow petty thief named Clarence Clay. The address was 105 Herbert Street, a small house in the heart of the West Dallas slums. It was here in early 1930 that Clyde Barrow would first meet Bonnie Parker, the woman whose name would forever be linked with his own. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October the 1st, 1910, in the small West Texas town of Rowena. She was the second of 3 children born to Charles Parker, a stonemason, and his wife, Emma. Bonnie had an older brother, Buster, and a younger sister, Billie Jean. The family lived modestly but comfortably on Charles Parker's wages until in 1914, when he died suddenly. Emma, widowed and left to raise 3 children alone, moved her family to Cement City in Dallas, where they lived with her elderly parents at 1152 Eagle Fort Drive. Life there was far harsher, but it was the place where Bonnie grew up. From an early age, Bonnie was high-spirited and attention-seeking. At Cement City Elementary, she was known for performing in front of the class as though it were a stage, jumping at every chance she got to speak or to sing. She got into constant mischief, reciting bawdy songs in Sunday school, cursing for laughs, and clowning her way into trouble. Teachers found her disruptive, but classmates adored her. Bonnie had striking blue eyes and an irrepressible energy that made her popular, funny, and impossible to ignore. By the age of 7, Bonnie was already performing publicly. Local politicians invited her to their rallies, letting her warm up the crowds with comic impressions of their rivals. She delighted audiences, sometimes even breaking into cartwheels and somersaults on stage. At one school play, she went so far as to punch a boy who pulled her hat from her head, only to win more cheers from the crowd. Bonnie craved the spotlight and loved nothing more than holding the attention of a room. Her mischief often carried beyond the classroom. However, she stole fruit from orchards, raided her grandfather's wine, and once even set fire to a barn. Though she could be wild and unruly, she also had the boys lining up outside her house with candy and trinkets, eager for her attention. For all her antics, Bonnie's charm and wit made her immensely popular. But more than anything, she wanted to be famous. Whether as an opera singer, a stage performer, or even a Hollywood starlet, every single penny she had went to the movies, where she dreamed of one day seeing her own name in lights, and she would. In 1926, a week before her 16th birthday, Bonnie married her school sweetheart, Roy Thornton. The couple moved to Olive Street in Dallas, living with Bonnie's mother, Emma, who was already preparing to help raise their future children. Bonnie longed to start a family, but Roy proved unreliable from the very beginning. He drank heavily, drifted in and out of petty crime, and often disappeared for months at a time. Bonnie remained fiercely loyal to him, but each absence left her heartbroken. By December of 1927, the marriage had collapsed. At just 17 years old, Bonnie was forced to accept the truth. Roy was gone, and he would never return to her. She threw him out for good and never looked back. At the start of 1928, Bonnie began looking for work, recording her attempts in her diary. She had a gift for writing, and perhaps she could have pursued it seriously, but instead she sought steady wages in Dallas. That January, she found employment as a waitress at Hargrave's Cafe on Swiss Avenue. The pay was meager, but Bonnie's quick wit and friendly banter earned her generous tips. Later, she moved on to Marco's Cafe at 702 Main Street, a diner popular with clerks, judges, and policemen from the nearby courthouse. Many of the same men who tipped her for coffee and pie would one day be chasing her across Texas. In November 1929, Marco's Cafe shut down in the wake of the stock market crash, and Bonnie was once again left without money with her estranged husband serving time in prison. She was just 19 years old, broke and directionless. But within weeks, her life and Texas history would change forever. On January the 5th, 1930, at the home of a small-time thief in West Dallas, Bonnie Parker met Clyde Barrow for the very first time. In January of 1930, Bonnie Parker walked into 105 Herbert Street in West Dallas. She was visiting Clarence Clay's sister, a friend of Bonnie's, who had broken her arm and needed help for a few days. She was making hot chocolate in the kitchen when in walked Clarence Clay's best friend, Clyde Barrow. The meeting was instant chemistry. Clyde was captivated by Bonnie's fiery spirit, and Bonnie was intrigued by his sharp clothes, quiet confidence, and the sense of danger that surrounded him. She didn't yet know that he was a criminal, but she knew that he was different. To Clyde, Bonnie was small in stature, just 4'11", but full of life and energy. For all her size, she carried herself with fire behind her blue eyes and steel beneath her blonde curls. She reminded him in some ways of his mother, feisty, loyal, and utterly devoted. To Bonnie, Clyde was handsome, sharply dressed, and always behind the wheel of a new car. Together they dreamed of more than poverty and obscurity. Bonnie wanted fame. Clyde wanted fear and respect, but both wanted their names in the papers. In February 1930, Clyde was still hiding from the law when police tracked him down to the house that Emma Parker shared with Bonnie and her children on Olive Street. He was arrested inside the home without resistance. Bonnie broke down in tears as officers dragged him out. She clung to him desperately, pleading for them to let him go. For days, she lay on the family's couch in hysterics, writing letters and vowing her loyalty. Bonnie quickly introduced herself to Clyde's family. His mother, Kumi, was unimpressed. Bonnie wore heavy makeup, dressed in 1920s flapper fashion, and spoke her mind freely. Yet, Bonnie's persistence was undeniable. She wrote to Clyde daily, visited him at every chance, and made it clear that she would not abandon him. Even Kumi came to see that Bonnie's devotion was genuine. Clyde managed to avoid conviction for his role in the 1929 jewelry store robbery. There was no direct evidence placing him at the scene, but he was still wanted for a string of burglaries and car thefts. He was transferred to McLennan County Jail in Waco, Texas, to await trial. This time the evidence was clear, and Clyde was sentenced to 14 years in prison, 2 years for each of 7 separate charges. Clyde considered the sentence unbearable, and with Bonnie living in Waco during the trial, the two plotted an escape. On one visit, he slipped her a map to a pistol hidden at the home of his cellmate, William Turner. Bonnie retrieved the weapon and smuggled it back to Clyde during another visit, passing it through the bars under the cover of a kiss. It was the first crime she ever committed on his behalf. On the night of the escape, Turner faked illness to lure a guard into his cell, and at gunpoint he locked the guard in the cell and released Clyde and another prisoner, Emery Abernathy. The trio overpowered the second guard and fled into the night. Clyde hot-wired a car, abandoned it after a few blocks, and then stole another, repeating the process as they moved westward. Their reliance on stolen cars left a clear trail for authorities, a pattern that would define many of Bonnie and Clyde's future crimes. Quick improvisation, reckless courage, and little forethought, Clyde sent word to Bonnie through one of his sisters, assuring her that they would be reunited soon. By March the 17th, 1930, Clyde, Turner, and Abernathy had reached Mabank, Texas. Desperate for cash, they broke into the Mabank Interurban Railway Depot and stole $60, but their luck ran out quickly. Lost on the back roads, they circled back into Mabank the very next morning and were arrested almost immediately. The newspapers mocked the trio as hapless amateurs who had walked straight back into town under the noses of police. During the trial, Kumi Barrow tried to protect her son, telling reporters he was only 18 years old when in fact he was 20, hoping to win him leniency, but no lie could soften what was coming. For Clyde Barrow, the protected world of petty theft and family loyalty was about to give way to the harsh reality of the Texas prison system. Clyde Barrow was sentenced to 14 years at Eastham Prison Farm in 1930. Known to inmates as the Bloody Ham, East had a reputation as one of the most brutal prisons in American history. Prisoners were forced to work in the fields from dawn until they collapsed, and those who attempted escape were often shot dead on sight. Starvation, beatings, and disease were part of daily life. Beyond its walls, rows of gravestones stood as a warning to any man who thought of running. Eastham was where Texas sent its most hardened offenders, and many who entered never came out alive. For Clyde, the experience was transformative. The young man who had once fantasized about living like a Hollywood outlaw quickly hardened into someone far darker. East replaced his romantic notions of banditry with a burning hatred for authority and a single-minded resolve for revenge. Together with a fellow inmate, Ralph Fultz, Clyde dreamed of one day returning to East to stage a raid, freeing prisoners and settling the score with the guards who had brutalized them. When his sister Nell visited, she was shocked to find Clyde emaciated. He was covered in bruises, had a broken nose, and 2 black eyes. His mother, Kumi, who had always defended her son, now turned her anger on the system itself. She launched petition after petition demanding Clyde's release, but each was denied as soon as it was filled. The family, once resigned to Clyde's criminal behavior, now came to see him as a victim of state cruelty. Their distrust of authority deepened, shaping the loyalty that would define the Barrows in the years to come. But Clyde's worst ordeal inside East was not the labor or the beatings. He was assigned to the same block as Big Ed Crowder, an inmate feared for his repeated sexual assaults on younger prisoners. Clyde became one of Crowder's victims, suffering abuse for over a year. Then came an offer from another inmate, Aubrey Scally, who was serving a life sentence. Scally proposed a deal. If Clyde killed Crowder, he would take the blame. For Scally, eliminating Crowder would improve his standing amongst inmates. For Clyde, it was a chance to end the torment. On October the 29th, 1931, Clyde struck. He bludgeoned Crowder with a metal pipe while Scally followed up with a knife, making as much noise as possible to draw the guards. When the officers arrived, they found Scally in the act. And true to his word, he claimed responsibility while Clyde slipped away unnoticed. This was the first time that Clyde Barrow killed a man. A month later, desperate to escape the back-breaking labor, Clyde maimed himself. He severed the big toe and second toe on his left foot with an axe, hoping the injury would earn him a transfer to the Huntsville prison system 35 miles away, where conditions were less severe. The pain was excruciating, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But the sacrifice was in vain. Before the transfer could be approved, Kumi's relentless appeals finally succeeded. The governor's office granted Clyde a pardon in January 1932, citing the severity of his sentence for someone so young. When he walked out of East that winter, Clyde Barrow was no longer the same man. He carried a limp, but more than that, he carried rage. As Ralph Fultz put it, he watched Clyde turn from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake. East had broken something inside him. And from that point on, he vowed he would never return to prison alive. If the law tried to take him again, he would fight to the death, taking as many officers with him as he could. There was one tether left to his former life, Bonnie Parker. Though she had begun to drift from him during his imprisonment, Clyde's devotion never faltered. He wanted 2 things above all else: Bonnie by his side and revenge on East. Whether driven by madness, anger, or survival, Clyde Barrow's war with the state of Texas had begun. When Clyde Barrow arrived at Bonnie Parker's home on Olive Street in January 1932, he was barely recognizable. Clyde hobbled into the living room on crutches, his left foot still unhealed, after he'd severed 2 of his own toes. He wore a new suit, but it hung loose on his frame. He was 50 pounds lighter than when Bonnie had last seen him. That day, Bonnie was sitting on the couch with her mother and a young man she had been courting. When Clyde walked through the door, Bonnie leapt from her seat and threw her arms around him, forgetting entirely about her guest. The bewildered suitor quietly excused himself, leaving Emma Parker to witness her daughter's reunion with the man who had just been pardoned from one of the most harshest prisons in America. Within hours, Bonnie packed up her belongings and went with Clyde to the Star Service Station at 1221 Eagle Ford Road, a filling station that Clyde's father had recently opened, and the site of the new Barrow residence. With the family living in a home behind the filling station, Clyde's plan was simple: to return to work, help with the family business, and rebuild his life. But Dallas law enforcement had other ideas. Furious that he had escaped east through a pardon, officers harassed him constantly. They stormed the service station, hauling him away for questioning whenever a theft, burglary, or robbery occurred in Dallas. Most of the time, they had nothing to charge him with, but the repeated raids made it impossible for Clyde to hold steady work or to live peacefully. His freedom was conditional, and everybody knew it. In March of 1932, Clyde received a visit from his old friend, Ralph Fultz. Ralph had recently been released from Eastham himself, and together with another associate, Raymond Hamilton, he had already organized a jailbreak at the McKinney jail. But Fultz had not forgotten the conversations that he and Clyde once shared about returning to East, not as prisoners, but as avengers. Both men believed Eastham deserved to be burned to the ground, and its guards punished for their cruelty. For them, revenge wasn't just personal. It was an act of justice for the downtrodden. At the Barrow residence, they swore to each other that one day they would raid the prison farm and set the inmates free. Over the next year, Clyde and Fultz dedicated themselves to raising money and gathering weapons for their cause. They stole cars, attempted small robberies, and cracked safes. But most of their early ventures were failures. Clyde could hotwire a vehicle and handle a break-in, but larger-scale heists often ended in disaster. Bonnie remained close by, though she avoided active participation. She was uneasy around guns and kept to the background, writing poems and waiting for Clyde to return from his exploits. Their first true success came in late March of 1932. Clyde, Hamilton, and Fultz passed through Lawrence, Kansas, and booked a room at the Hotel Eldridge across from the First National Bank at 74 Massachusetts Street. Unlike his earlier blunders, Clyde carefully planned this robbery. At opening time, they stormed the bank and locked the bank manager and 2 employees in the vault, emptied the tills, and made their escape. By 11 o'clock, they were 300 m away in East Street, Louis counting their spoils. The take was a small fortune in the heart of the Great Depression. $33,000, around $780,000 today. It was more money than any of them had ever seen. Hamilton soon left, taking his cut of the money and striking out on his own. For him, his share of $11,000 was a ticket to freedom, an opportunity to live high and enjoy the spoils without the burden of planning or restraint. Clyde and Ralph Fultz, however, had no intention of celebrating their success with luxuries or leisure. Every dollar in their eyes was a tool, something to be reinvested into weapons, cars, and safe houses. The 2 men still carried the scars of Eastham Prison Farm. Their thoughts never strayed far from revenge, of one day returning with enough firepower to break the gates, free the men still trapped inside, and humiliate the system that had tried to crush them. But their plan backfired. They spent thousands on Thompson submachine guns and bulletproof vests, only to discover that they had been conned. The weapons were defective, and the vests were useless against bullets. Overnight, their fortune evaporated, leaving them broke and ill-equipped. Despite this, they managed to recruit a handful of new members, and the Barrow Gang, as the press still called them, expanded. But the gang's misadventures quickly became infamous. On April the 14th, 1932, their car broke down near Electra, Texas. When a passerby stopped to help, Clyde then stole his vehicle and drove to Amarillo, intending to rob a bank, only to pull up behind the sheriff's car parked in front of the very building. The sheriff attempted to arrest them on the spot, but Clyde brandished a pistol and the gang fled. They then commandeered a civilian's car, forcing the driver and 3 passengers to carry them out of town. Once safely away, they released the hostages unharmed. Then, at the Texas-Oklahoma border, the car ran out of gas, so they hijacked a mailman's truck, forcing him to endure a harrowing ride as Clyde barreled through the toll booth under gunfire. The gang later apologized, returned the man's mailbag, and even agreed to burn the truck so that he could claim the insurance on it. The vehicle was found smoldering only a few blocks from the Barrow family home near the Houston Street Viaduct. 2 weeks later, on April the 27th, 1932, Clyde acted as the getaway driver in a robbery in Hillsboro, Texas. Their target was the pawn shop, owned by J.N. Booker. Clyde knew the Booker family. He was recognizable by sight. And when the idea surfaced to rob the store safe, he volunteered to act as the driver rather than risk being seen inside. Late that night, Ralph Fultz knocked on the door of Booker's store with a simple request. He wanted guitar strings. Clyde's love of music stretched back to his boyhood, when his family's home was filled with song, even in the poorest of times, and the request struck an eerily personal chord. Fultz offered a $10 bill, knowing that Booker would have to open the safe to make change. What they didn't know was that Booker also kept a pistol inside. As he reached into the safe, he pulled his weapon, but before he could fire, he was shot through the heart. He died instantly in his own shop. It was the first murder directly tied to Clyde Barrow's name. Even though he had never stepped inside the store that night, the press wasted no time in associating him with the killing, and his reputation began to darken. Yet Clyde's focus didn't waver. Even as the gang stumbled through failed robberies and now faced the weight of murder, his mind remained fixed on Eastham Prison. Bonnie, frustrated with her role as a bystander, asked to take part in the plans. Her first task was to deliver a message to Aubrey Scaly, the life-sentenced inmate who had taken the blame for Clyde's killing of Ed Crowder. But predictably, their plans unraveled almost immediately in Tyler, Texas. Whilst they were stealing weapons from a hardware store, the gang were confronted by an angry mob. Their car was forced into the mud, and Clyde, Bonnie, and Fultz were chased through the rain until they were able to seek shelter in a farmhouse. The farmer offered them mules to reach the nearby town of Kemp, soaked, exhausted, and bleeding from a gunshot wound to the arm. Fultz rode alongside Bonnie into the town, who had lost one of her shoes along the way. But their luck worsened in Kemp. They attempted to steal more cars, but ran out of gas almost instantly. As they tried to steal another car, another mob formed, driving them into a creek bed just outside of town, and that was where Clyde made the most fateful decision of the day. He fled, leaving Bonnie and Fultz behind. The two were captured and taken to this remarkably dismal cell in Kemp called the Kemp Calaboose, where a furious crowd gathered outside demanding their deaths. The cell is still standing today and now has a plaque outside commemorating the event. Inside the calaboose, Fultz insisted that Bonnie was innocent, claiming she had been kidnapped and held against her will. Whether anyone believed him or not, Bonnie had no prior criminal record which helped her case. That night, as the mob roared outside, she wrote a poem on scraps of paper. It was titled Suicide Cell, and it was a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and undying devotion to a gangster lover. For Bonnie, the poem was as much a confession as performance. She had been abandoned, yet she still clung to her loyalty. Fultz was sent back to Eastham, while Bonnie was sent to Kaufman County Jail, where she was eventually released after 3 weeks without charges. Clyde's grand plan to strike back at the prison was in ruins, and his reputation had begun to grow even darker. His gang was mocked in the press as amateurish, his loyalty questioned, and his name increasingly tied to bloodshed. But for Clyde Barrow, Eastham remained the obsession. He had vowed to destroy it, and the vow still burned. For now, however, the vow would remain burning. When Bonnie Parker stepped out of the Kaufman County Jail in June of 1932, her time inside had been brief, but it had left a lasting change. She understood now fully that her life with Clyde would be a short one. He would pursue his revenge against the prison system until the end, and the end would almost certainly be death. Yet she no longer wavered. Whatever happened to Clyde would happen to her. She was entirely devoted to him, and she had made her choice, and her future, whether it ended in prison or in a hail of bullets, would be tied to him. On June the 17th, as she walked out of the courthouse, Clyde's face was appearing on wanted posters across Texas. A reward had been posted for his capture, and law enforcement had come to realize the danger of a desperate young man with no organization, no discipline, and no fear. At last, Clyde Barrow had achieved what he had always wanted, his name in print. Bonnie wasted no time in rejoining him. A day after her release, she told Clyde plainly, if he was on the run, then so was she. In the 2 years that they had known one another, they had spent less than 6 months together without a set of prison bars separating them. That separation was over. She was in it fully now, wherever it led. But after the duo committed a few small-time robberies, it was not only Clyde's name that began to circulate. Police investigators revealed reports of a young blonde woman, small in stature, who had been seen at or near many of the gang's robberies. When newspapers picked up the story, it transformed what had been an otherwise remarkable tale of a small-time thief into something sensational. Clyde's criminal career up to this point had been chaotic and unimpressive, marked more by blunders than by profits. But once the press began to speculate about the identity of the mystery woman at his side, the story of Bonnie and Clyde was born. Without Bonnie Parker, Clyde might have just been another forgotten Depression-era criminal, but with her, he became a legend. After a string of robberies, the police realized that Clyde had his consistencies. Chief among them was his devotion to stealing Ford V8s. He favored them because they were faster than most police cars, and their heavy steel bodies could absorb bullets. Whatever else might be said about Clyde Barrow's failings as a robber, even the law admitted that he was an extraordinary driver. Time and time again, police would be left in the dust, unable to keep pace, as Clyde maneuvered through back roads and city streets alike. It was often only his skill behind the wheel that allowed the gang to escape capture so often. But despite the escapes, staying in their native Dallas was too hot. Clyde's face was known, his name notorious, and every officer in the city was hunting him. With the pressure rising, Bonnie and Raymond Hamilton, who had resurfaced, having spent his $11,000 left for Oklahoma on August the 5th, 1932, they reached Stringtown. The town was holding a country dance that night, and the trio decided to stay. They parked nearby, drinking illegal moonshine out of their car whilst the locals celebrated. When Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and his deputy Eugene Moore approached to arrest them for drinking, Clyde and Hamilton opened fire. Deputy Moore was killed instantly, and Sheriff Maxwell survived, but was left paralyzed for the rest of his life. This killing was Clyde's first committed murder outside of prison. An associate who was with them at the time, called Ross Dyer, of whom no photos have survived fled the scene but was arrested shortly after, while boarding a bus. Under questioning, Dyer named Clyde and Hamilton as the shooters. Clyde returned home to West Dallas, where the Barrow family sheltered him as they always had. They gave him food and hair dyed to disguise himself. For the first time, Bonnie's name also appeared in the press. Now identified as Clyde's companion, she too had to dye her hair, darkening her signature blonde. From then on, Bonnie became not only the one to dye her own hair, but also Clyde's and any of the accomplices that were traveling with them. Family accounts from this time describe the lovers in stark contrast. Nell recalled that Clyde seemed cheerful and energized whenever he came home, while Bonnie appeared worn down and exhausted. The strain of life on the road was beginning to show on her, and there was no let-up. With the police closing in, Bonnie and Clyde left Dallas again, and with each robbery, their notoriety grew. Accomplices who passed through the gang all agreed on one thing. Bonnie never fired a gun, but she played a critical role nonetheless. She reloaded Clyde's pistols with remarkable speed, keeping him armed as he drove. Their escapes became a grim routine. Clyde behind the wheel, Bonnie handing him loaded weapons, and whichever gunman they had with them, firing wildly at pursuing officers. They rarely made much money, and the casualties they inflicted were sporadic, but they perfected the getaway into an art. The newspapers couldn't decide which angle they liked more, the romance of Bonnie and Clyde or the incompetence of law enforcement. Every week, the pair seemed to appear in a new headline, and the public ate it up. Meanwhile, the Barrow family continued to shield them, receiving postcards with cash tucked inside. For perhaps the only time in their lives, the Barrows were not going to bed hungry, and they had no intention of betraying the ones who made that possible. The legend grew, and soon Clyde raised the stakes. The gang raided the Texas National Guard Armory in Ranger, Texas, stealing enough high-powered rifles to fill the trunks of 2 cars. It was the kind of theft that could no longer be ignored. For the first time, federal law enforcement took notice. The Bureau of Investigation and its director, J. Edgar Hoover, were now watching Bonnie and Clyde. But during the robbery, Clyde had found what became his true third love after Bonnie and music. The Browning automatic rifle, heavy, brutal, and capable of spitting out rounds at a terrifying speed, the bar turned a skinny Dallas farm boy into one of the most dangerous men in America. He cut down the barrels, welded 3 magazines together into a single 56-round clip, and nicknamed it his scatter gun. At this point, they were in possession of 5 bars, and they were the reason the gang were to get away from so many close calls. With a single burst, Clyde could shed a pursuing patrol car, punching holes through the steel, engines, and men alike. It gave him the edge he needed, a way to hold off dozens of officers with only a few bursts of fire. It was also the reason that lawmen decided they could never take him alive. The moment they saw the muzzle of that weapon, they ducked for cover. It was the gun that kept Bonnie and Clyde alive. After all the close shaves, Raymond Hamilton had had enough. By this point, the reward for their capture had risen into the thousands, and he could see that Bonnie and Clyde's faces were everywhere. They could no longer appear in public without risk, and the pressure was mounting. Hamilton decided to leave, retreating to a small town in Texas where he hoped to disappear. But he lasted only weeks. Arrested soon after, he was sentenced to 200 years in prison for the robberies, kidnappings, and murders that he had taken part in. His brief career as an outlaw for now was over. The next few months after Hamilton's departure were rife with troubles for Bonnie and Clyde, yet they were some of the happiest the pair ever had. Constantly on the move, they spent their days stealing cars, driving them until the tanks were dry, and then abandoning them for another. They slept along the roadside, bathed in creeks, and relied on the kindness of farmers for shelter. Clyde bought Bonnie a typewriter so that she could pass the long hours in the back seat, writing poetry as the miles rolled beneath them. Life on the road, however, did not come easily to Bonnie. She feared spiders, snakes, and thunderstorms, and the wilderness offered no relief from any of them. To calm her nerves, she began drinking. Though Clyde disapproved, he rarely touched alcohol, and when he did, it was sparingly. He preferred control and clarity, even while living a life of constant uncertainty. Music was his true escape. Clyde carried his battered saxophone in the car, pulling it out during quiet nights in the woods. More than one farmer's wife later swore that if you listened hard enough, you could hear the soft strains of his saxophone drifting through the trees. Had life taken a different turn, Clyde Barrow might have been remembered for his music rather than his marksmanship. A young man known for coaxing tunes from a saxophone instead of bullets from a Browning automatic rifle. They returned to Dallas only once that year on Halloween of 1932, and the visit was brief. Bonnie slipped into her mother's arms for a quick embrace, while Clyde tossed a Coke bottle into the yard of the Barrow home with a note inside, instructing the family to meet them outside of town. When they did, the Barrows passed along the news that the press was now attributing nearly every murder and robbery in Texas to Bonnie and Clyde. Some of these crimes had taken place hundreds of miles from where the pair had been hiding, but accuracy mattered little. Sensationalism sold and the papers delivered. The stories became increasingly outrageous. Reporters painted Bonnie as the driving force behind the crimes, a pistol-wielding vixen who gunned down innocent men with both hands firing. The truth was far less dramatic. Bonnie had still never fired a gun at anyone. She was terrified of weapons, just as she was terrified of the woods where she was forced to sleep. But in the public imagination, she became something larger than life. Her image spread quickly. Theaters ran newsreels featuring the Barrow gang, often with Bonnie front and center before feature films. Here's a notorious couple. Farmer Sheeper says he saw Bandit Barrow and his girl companion Bonnie Parker. These photographs of the outlaws are being circulated by the police through the Southwest to aid in their identification. The girl always carries at least 2 guns with Barrow. She's accused of audiences flocked to see the glamorous young woman who had chosen the life of an outlaw, sometimes buying tickets to the cinema just for the newsreel. It hardly mattered that most of the stories were fabrications. Fame was fame, and Bonnie relished it. For the first time, her name and face were known far beyond West Dallas. For Clyde, it was less welcome. He had wanted his name feared and respected. But now it was Bonnie's photograph that drew the headlines. Worse still, her notoriety made her too recognizable to serve as a lookout or a decoy. Sending her into banks or shops under the guise of a customer became increasingly risky, and her fame, though intoxicating, also narrowed their options. The end of 1932 brought the duo little reward. Over the holiday season, they drifted across the Midwest, attempting a string of robberies, targeting banks, filling stations, and small stores. But their efforts yielded in only a few hundred. Temporary additions to the gang came and went, often stealing what little cash there was before vanishing overnight. For all their growing fame, the Barrow gang was still chaotic, disorganized, and largely unsuccessful. Yet, their legend continued to attract followers. On Christmas Eve, Bonnie and Clyde returned to the Barrow family service station, where they met William Daniel W.D. Jones, a local teenager who had been collecting stolen license plates to help the gang. Like many young Texans of the Depression era, he saw Bonnie and Clyde as rebellious folk heroes. Clyde offered him a place in the gang, and from that night on, W.D. Jones rode with the duo. But notoriety has a way of catching up. The press could only romanticize their exploits for so long before the violence became undeniable. Their days of petty thefts and fleeting headlines were ending. And ahead lay a trail not of blunders, but of blood. On Boxing Day, 1932, Clyde Barrow committed his third murder. Only hours after a failed robbery botched by their newest recruit, 16-year-old W.D. Jones, the gang spotted a Model T Ford parked outside a home at 606 South 13th Street in Temple, Texas. Clyde climbed into the driver's seat and began to hotwire the car, but its owner, 27-year-old Doyle Johnson, of whom no photos exist, rushed outside and grabbed Clyde around the neck through the open window. A shot rang out, and Johnson collapsed on the sidewalk in front of his wife, father-in-law, and newborn child, killed instantly. With 3 murders now tied to his name, Clyde's list of enemies grew longer. Authorities moved quickly to connect him to every crime they could. They focused on one man they did have in custody, Raymond Hamilton. Hamilton was already facing charges from the Hillsborough robbery in which J.N. Booker had been killed. From Eastern Prison, Hamilton sent word to Clyde that he'd been charged with the crime. The Bloody Hem farm had returned to haunt Clyde once more. In response, Clyde arranged for W.D. Jones's sister, Lillian, to smuggle Hamilton a radio. Inside were 2 hidden hacksaws, but the plan failed when Hamilton was discovered with the blades before he could make his escape. On January the 6th, 1933, Clyde came to check on the delivery at Lillian's home at 3111 North Thoppel Avenue in Dallas. Officers had already surrounded the property, hidden in the trees and bushes. Lillian shouted a warning as Clyde approached the driveway, giving him just enough time to turn and run. Deputy Malcolm Davis cornered him, but Clyde shot him in the chest before fleeing. Malcolm Davis died where he fell on the porch of the house. In less than 9 months, Clyde Barrow and his gang had killed 5 people. For the next 3 months, the gang drifted through the Midwest. They robbed small stalls to keep themselves afloat, camped in the woods, and took candid photographs with a stolen camera. Clyde played his guitar and saxophone at night, while Bonnie wrote poems. Her writings from that time reflected a strange contentment. painting a picture of two lovers bound together despite hardships of living rough on the road. In April, Buck Barrow and his wife Blanche, along with her small white dog Snowball, came looking for Clyde. They found him and Bonnie in a rented apartment at 3347 Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri. Buck had intended to persuade his younger brother to surrender and to come home, but instead the visit turned into a week-long party. They drank heavily, played cards, and fired guns into the night. Neighbors, assuming that the rowdy group were bootleggers, reported them to the police. On April the 13th, 5 officers arrived at the apartment to investigate. They barely made it up the driveway before gunfire erupted. Clyde, Book, and young W.D. Jones opened fire as Blanche ran after her frightened dog, and Bonnie scrambled to start the car. Detective Harry McGinnis was hit by rifle fire from Clyde. His arm was torn away, severing the main artery, and he bled to death. Constable J.W. Harmon was struck at least 10 times. A shot to the neck killed him instantly. Sergeant G.B. Cara was wounded when a shotgun blast from Book shattered the tree he was using for cover, sending splinters into his face. Clyde's luck, as it always did, held. A bullet that should have struck him in the chest was deflected by a button on his jacket. Book was grazed by another shot, and Jones, the teenager, was struck in the stomach, but continued to fire from the ground, with 2 officers dead and another grievously wounded. The gang piled into the car with Bonnie at the wheel, scooping up Blanche and Snowball as they sped away. That night they camped in the countryside, desperately trying to keep Jones alive, with nothing more than aspirin and a bandage. By the following day, they had reached Dallas and left Jones in the care of Cumier Barrow, hoping he would recover. For the next several weeks, the gang stuck to the back roads, stopping only to change cars or to rob small stores. By now, the majority of their killings were of law enforcement officers, and police across the Midwest were enraged, with the press only fanning the flames. Newspapers attributed every unsolved robbery and murder to Bonnie and Clyde, often in places hundreds of miles away from their actual whereabouts. Rumors ran wild, and every fair-haired girl in the region seemed to be reported to police as Bonnie Parker. Back in Joplin, investigators scoured the abandoned property. What they found would catapult Bonnie and Clyde into national infamy. Inside were books, release papers, a whole host of guns and ammunition, Bonnie's poetry, and rolls of undeveloped film. When the photographs were printed, they showed Bonnie and Clyde posing with cigars, pistols, and rifles, grinning into the camera like actors on a stage. The images became instant sensations. Within days, their faces appeared in newspapers across the United States. The duo had been getting a lot of press in Dallas and Texas. But with the discovery of these new photos, the myth of Bonnie and Clyde, the glamorous outlaw couple, had well and truly swept the nation. They read the papers themselves, laughing at the headlines. Bonnie especially delighted in seeing her poem Suicide Sal praised in print. Yet their reality remained far less glamorous. They had lost most of their possessions in Joplin, and they were nearly broke. On May the 18th, 1933, they staged a rare, successful robbery at the State Bank in Okabena, Minnesota. Clyde and Book broke into the building through the roof and lay in wait overnight. In the morning, when the first employees arrived, they forced them at gunpoint to open the vault. The brothers escaped with nearly $2,000. Not a fortune, but enough to keep the gang moving. But the strain of life on the run was taking its toll. They returned to pick up Jones from Dallas, and the duo were traveling with Book, Blanche, Jones, and Snowball, meaning the car was crowded, and tensions rose daily. Bonnie's poetry grew darker, reflecting her exhaustion. She and Clyde fought often, but no matter how bitter the arguments got, Clyde carried her to bed each night and told her that he loved her. Their devotion endured, even as everything else frayed. The Okabena money lasted only weeks. By June, they were once again desperate. On June the 9th, they hit a grocery store and took $4,500, which was an unexpected haul because stores didn't usually carry that much cash. The very next day, on June the 10th, Clyde took Bonnie and Jones on a joyride down Texas Highway 203 to celebrate. What began as a carefree outing would end in tragedy, leaving Bonnie Parker permanently scarred and changing the course of her life forever. On June the 10th, 1933, Clyde Barrow's luck finally caught up with him. He'd been driving recklessly for years, always pushing stolen Fords to their limit, testing the edge between daring escape and sudden death. But that summer evening, just 6 miles outside of Wellington, Texas, there was no escape to be had. Construction crews had dismantled the bridge across the Salt Fork of the Red River, leaving the highway cut clean in two. There were no lanterns, no barricades, and no warning signs. Nothing to stop a speeding motorist from plunging into disaster. Clyde came tearing down the road at nearly 70 miles per hour, the engine roaring, dust pluming in his wake. In the passenger seat, Bonnie Parker leaned against the window, chatting with Jones in the back. And then, in an instant, the road was gone. The car shot forward, wheels spinning in thin air, before crashing nose first into the dry riverbed below. Metal screamed as it buckled, and glass shattered everywhere. The impact hurled Bonnie out of the passenger side window. The car then rolled over her small frame, pinning her beneath its weight. In the collision, the vehicle's battery ruptured, spilling acid across the ground and onto Bonnie's legs. Her screams pierced the air as the corrosive liquid soaked her flesh. By the time that Clyde and Jones managed to pull her out from underneath the car, a lot of her muscle had been eaten away, and bone was actually visible through the calf of her right leg. Her tendons contracted in the burn, leaving her leg permanently curled upwards, and the pain must have been beyond description. A farmer from a nearby field called Sam Pritchard rushed to help. Pritchard dragged Bonnie free with Clyde and Jones's help and carried her to his farmhouse. There, Sam's wife and daughter tried to desperately save her. They dressed her wounds with baking soda, wrapped the burns, and did what they could to ease her agony. They reset Clyde's broken nose and bandaged the chemical burns on Jones's arms. But Bonnie's condition was far more serious. Every breath she took came with a scream. Pritchard, shaken by the sight of the 22-year-old girl writhing in pain, insisted she needed a hospital or she would die. But Clyde refused. He would not risk arrest. Even as Bonnie cried for her mother, Clyde forbade them from calling an ambulance. Pritchard ignored him and phoned the sheriff. Within hours, 2 officers arrived at the farmhouse, but Clyde and Jones were prepared. They drew pistols, overpowered the officers, and bound them with their own handcuffs. Bonnie, shaking and half-conscious, whispered that she would rather die with Clyde than give herself up. And so, despite her horrifying injuries, she was loaded into Pritchard's car, which Clyde and Jones stole from him, with the 2 officers now as hostages, and the gang fled. Clyde had wanted to kill the officers, but the men had given advice on how to treat Bonnie's burns, even offering words of comfort to her in the back seat as they drove. That act of decency spared their lives. They drove 50 miles before releasing the officers near Eric, Oklahoma, and the gang pressed west into Arkansas, finally reaching Fort Smith. There they rented a cabin at the Midway tourist camp on Highway 71 and found a doctor willing to treat Bonnie. His name was Dr. Walter Aberley, and he knew perfectly well who they were. By 1933, Bonnie and Clyde's photographs were in every newspaper in the country, but he never reported them, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of sympathy. He quietly dressed Bonnie's wounds and prescribed her Amital, and soon Bonnie had a dependency on that as well as her ever-increasing drinking. For a month they stayed hidden in Fort Smith, while Clyde stole cars and food to keep them alive. Bonnie hovered between life and death, her frail body wasting away from burns that would never fully heal. On June the 23rd, Clyde drove the crew nearly 500 miles east to Alma, Arkansas. Desperate to secure funds, he targeted the R.L. Brown grocery market, and the robbery yielded only $20, but it ended in blood. During the escape, 2 officers gave chase. Buck Barrow leaned from the window with a shotgun and fired. The blast tore into the Almatown Marshal Henry D. Humphrey's chest, killing him instantly. Another innocent man had fallen to the Barrow gang. By July, Clyde relocated the gang to a remote cabin high in the Boston Mountains of the Ozarks, near Waldron, Arkansas. Here, Bonnie slowly regained some mobility, but she would never fully recover. Her right leg remained scarred and contracted, forcing her to limp with a painful hop. She relied on whiskey to dull the pain, drinking daily, even as Clyde refused to touch the bottle. Meanwhile, Book and Jones kept the gang afloat with a small string of robberies. And Clyde stole a nearby doctor's car, along with a medical bag, ensuring Bonnie had bandages and morphine. Yet the reality was plain. Bonnie Parker would never again walk normally. With Bonnie able to stand, if only barely, the gang left their mountain refuge in mid-July. They drifted through the quiet streets of Fort Dodge, Iowa, staging a spree so sloppy it looked almost childish. They ransacked gas stations, one after another, cleaning out cash registers, forcing attendants into the back seat, and even prying open gumball machines for pennies. In 15 minutes, they'd taken 3 stations, filled the car with hostages, and then realized they had no more room. So Clyde let everyone go, pockets jingling with a grand total of $150. It was hardly the big score they needed, but it kept them on the road. Still, the spree created a trail. Clyde drove the 250 miles to Kansas City in under 4 hours, hammering the Ford V8 at a near-suicidal speed. His reasoning was simple. Kansas City was a major crime hub, a place where their faces could blend into the crowds, and where the constant chum of traffic made stolen cars less noticeable. With Bonnie's condition worsening, he wanted somewhere they could rest and patch themselves up for more than a single night on the roadside. But Buck hated the idea. Kansas City was still swarming with lawmen, in the wake of the Kansas City massacre only weeks before, when gunmen had slaughtered a police escort at Union Station. To Buck, it was suicide to hide out in a town that was crawling with state, federal, and local officers, all itching to make another arrest. Clyde didn't care. He was tired. Bonnie was half crippled, and they needed brick walls around them instead of canvas tents. At a busy crossroads north of Kansas City, in Platte City, known to the locals as the Junction, 2 landmarks faced each other across the road. On one side stood Slim's Castle, a bright neon-lit service station, cafe, and convenience store. On the other side, a row of sturdy brick cabins with their own garages attached to a tavern, the Red Crown Tavern, and tourist court. Buck didn't like the spot. With Prohibition coming to an end, not that anyone followed Prohibition at all, the tavern was absolutely packed. But Clyde liked what he saw immediately. The cabins had garages attached to them, a luxury for men who needed to hide their cars. The walls were brick, not flimsy wood. And in Clyde's mind, it meant security, something immovable. He turned to the gang and made up his mind. "This is where we stay," he told them, "even if we all get killed before morning." And so, against Book's warnings and Blanche's better instincts, the Barrow gang settled into the Red Crown tourist cabins, an ill-fated choice that would soon bring them face to face with the largest armed posse that they had ever seen. Blanche was sent to book the rooms. She wore a pair of tight jodhpurs, horse-riding pants that no one in Platte City had ever seen on a woman before. She drew unwanted attention everywhere she went. She paid for meals and rooms with nothing but coins, jangling handfuls of change from the gumball and vending machines they'd smashed open on their petty raids. Blanche paid for 3 guests with nothing but coins, even though there were 5 of them. Clyde's plan was to disguise their numbers if anyone came asking. What he didn't realize was that the Red Crown Tavern was a favorite meeting spot for Missouri Highway Patrol officers. The manager immediately noticed that something wasn't right. He watched Clyde back the car into the garage, nose out, ready for a quick getaway. Blanche came back to the tavern that night and ordered 5 chicken dinners and 5 beers for her party of 3. She paid again with coins, and suspicion only thickened. The next morning, Clyde taped newspapers over the windows, making it obvious that they had something to hide. Blanche bought 5 more meals again for her supposed party of 3. And this time, Sheriff Holt Coffey himself was watching her from across the tavern. He recognized Blanche Barrow from the wanted posters, and he smelled outlaw blood instantly. Coffey assembled a force of 12 lawmen armed with Thompson submachine guns, rifles, and even an armored car rigged with boilerplate steel. Dozens of townsfolk tagged along with their own guns, itching for a fight. Coffey and his posse were heavily armed, knowing they'd need to be to have any chance of bringing down the gang. And their bars. For the first time, Bonnie and Clyde were not up against a couple of unsuspecting deputies stumbling into their hideout. They were up against a small army, armed and ready. Just after 11 p.m. on July the 20th, the posse surrounded the cabins. Sheriff Coffey banged sharply on Book and Blanche's door, telling her to put her trousers on and come out. Blanche shouted back loudly that the men he was after were in the other cabin, and Clyde heard her warning. He and Jones opened fire through the windows with their Browning automatic rifles. The roar of the bars was deafening, cutting through the brick and splintering wood. Book joined him with his own rifle, and the lawmen staggered under the sheer force of the barrage. The officers fired back, Tommy guns rattling, but they were outgunned. The gang's bar slugs tore through walls, windows, even into the tavern kitchen, where one bullet ripped through a stove and lodged in Coffey's son, Clarence's arm. Another barrage struck the armored car, ripping into the knees of its driver and shattering the horn, which blared wildly into the night. The lawmen mistook it for a ceasefire signal and fell back. Inside the cabin, Clyde saw his chance. He bundled Bonnie and Jones through the inner door into the garage and loaded them into the car. But Buck and Blanche weren't so lucky. They had no inner door. They had to run through open fire. As Book sprinted for the car, a round caught him in the temple, tearing through his skull and blowing away part of his forehead. He collapsed, firing his bar skyward as he went down. Blanche, 80 pounds of desperation, dragged her husband's limp body to the car whilst glass exploded around her. Jones laid down cover fire so that they could make it. Clyde roared the engine and shot out of the garage, barreling straight past, and his men. Another hail of bullets raided the car. A burst shattered the rear window, blasting shards into Blanche's face and blinding her. She screamed as glass shredded her eyes. Incredibly, Clyde got them clear. The car, riddled with bullets, disappeared into the Missouri night, and remarkably, no officer had been killed. When the smoke cleared, the officers found an arsenal left behind in the cabins, 6 Browning rifles, dozens of Colt .45 pistols, and Bonnie's uneaten chicken dinner still sitting on the table. The papers called it the gang's most desperate escape yet, and they began gaining a reputation that they would never be caught. But inside the getaway car, the reality was grim. Blanche was blind, her eyes shredded by glass. Book's skull was blown open, his brain exposed, and Bonnie, burned and crippled, wept in the back seat as Clyde drove them into the darkness. The wounded outlaws drove 200 meters north to an abandoned amusement park, Dexterfield Park, near Dexter, Iowa. There, in a field, they took stock of the damage. Blanche was half blind. Book lay near death, his brain exposed, but still clinging to life. Clyde and Jones dug a shallow grave, preparing for the inevitable. Yet Book survived. He lingered for 3 days, semi-conscious, sipping water and eating crackers. His body grotesquely mutilated, but he was stubbornly alive. Blanche refused to leave his side. Her left eye was ruined by a shard of glass, but her right eye retained partial vision. She wore sunglasses to protect it from the light. But the gang's presence in Dexter did not go unnoticed. Locals spotted Clyde limping, Jones carrying a frail Bonnie, who now weighed barely 80 pounds, and Book's head wrapped in bloody bandages. Bonnie and Clyde were perhaps the most famous and recognizable people in the States, and a Girl Scout troop, 2 hikers, and several farmers all reported sightings. Sheriff Clint took no chances. He assembled nearly 100 men from the National Guard, the Iowa Bureau of Investigation, local deputies, townsmen, and even a reporter and photographer. This would be no small raid. It would be a spectacle. At dawn on July the 24th, the law descended. Clyde shouted a warning to the oncoming posse, but a nervous civilian opened fire, triggering a battle. Hundreds of rounds tore through the field. Jones was shot in the chest and thigh, his face shredded by flying glass. Clyde was struck in the leg, arm, and shoulder, and Blanche shielded Book with her body, dragging him towards the car as bullets whistled past. The gang rose and tried to flee, but Book collapsed 20 feet from their campsite. Bonnie, Jones, and Clyde escaped on foot. Blanche refused to leave Book. She lit a cigarette, placed it between his lips, and cradled him until the officers caught up with them. When they did, Buck raised his pistol, only to be riddled with 6 more bullets. Still, he lived. Remarkably, he even stood on his feet, clutching his wife as he was taken prisoner. "Daddy, whatever they do to me," Blanche whispered, "I will always love you." Buck Barrow was transported to King's Daughters Hospital in Perry, Iowa, where he lingered for 5 more days, surrounded by his family, before pneumonia claimed him on July the 29th, 1933. He never stopped asking for Blanche. She was hauled off to jail, her vision ruined, her spirit broken. She had begged Book to turn back when they first sought out Clyde, but love had kept her bound to him. Even Jed Gahu admitted she never fired a shot. She was sentenced to 10 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary, where she became known as one of the kindest, gentlest inmates that the prison had ever seen. Sheriff Holt Coffey himself visited her often, remaining her friend until death. Blanche remarried, adopted a son, and lived quietly into old age. Yet Hoover kept her under surveillance until her dying day. Meanwhile, Clyde, Bonnie, and Jones escaped on foot, crossing a river to the far side of the hill and onto a farm owned by John Feller. Jones carried the skeletal Bonnie in his arms, her face pale, her body weighing scarcely 80 pounds. John Feller and his family emerged as the trio approached his farm, and Clyde, bleeding from multiple wounds, leveled a pistol at them and demanded their car. The pistol was empty, but the family didn't know that. They handed over their vehicle, and the gang sped away, almost in disbelief that they were still alive. The Dexfield shootout had reduced the Barrow gang to a shattered core. Buck was dead. Blanche was imprisoned. Jones was gravely wounded, and Bonnie was crippled for life. Yet still, Clyde Barrow pressed forward. The prison farm still loomed in his mind, and his vow remained the same. He would never be taken alive. If the law wanted his blood, he was determined to make them pay dearly for every last drop. For the next 6 weeks, the remaining trio zigzagged across the Midwest, driving in circles with no clear destination. They restocked the arsenal they left behind at Red Crown by robbing an armory in Platteville, Illinois, reuniting Clyde with 3 of his beloved bar rifles. Their teenage sidekick, W.D. Jones, was reaching his breaking point. He'd been shot at, chased across 6 states, and seen more corpses than most men twice his age, and he had had enough. But with Bonnie's body mangled from burns and Clyde's injuries slowing him down, they could barely even drive. They had no food, no spare clothes, and hardly a penny between them. Jones told Clyde he'd stay until they were steady enough to survive without him. Clyde made him swear that if the law ever caught up to him, Jones was to lie through his teeth and to save himself by any means necessary. He was instructed to tell them that he'd been kidnapped, beaten into submission, chained up at night, or whatever it took. "Tell the feds I forced you," Clyde told him. Clyde was already damned, and he knew it. Another lie or 2 on his head didn't matter, but if Jones could scrape by with mercy, then at least one of them might be able to escape the death sentence that he and Bonnie knew was inevitable for them. Both of them carried that knowledge. They weren't long for this world. Whether their bodies gave out or the bullets finally found their mark, it was only a matter of time. All they wanted now was to see their families once more. Jones stuck around long enough to help them limp back into form. He carried out a few small-time robberies for them, just to keep the trio alive. For the next 4 months, Clyde and Bonnie drove slow and painful miles across the country, fending off infection and fighting exhaustion. By early September, they risked the one thing that Clyde had always promised they wouldn't, going home. On the way south, they dropped Jones near Houston, where his mother lived, and carried on to Dallas. Emma Parker burst into tears when she saw her daughter. Bonnie was skeletal. Her leg was curled up under her permanently, her body covered in scars, hobbling forward on what little strength she had left. Clyde, too, was a shadow of himself, gaunt and frightened. For the first time, the Barrow family saw fear in his eyes. These weren't the brash outlaws the papers described. These were two people beaten half to death, worn down and hopeless. Two people who knew that their days were numbered. Clyde couldn't bring himself to leave Dallas again. He didn't have the strength, and Bonnie was far worse off than him. Through the fall, they slept in their car around the outskirts of the city, while their families kept them alive with food, medicine, and blankets. For 2 whole months, the Barrow and Parker households shielded them from the world. But they all knew that it couldn't last. Clyde, when fully back to strength, became restless and desperate, and went back to robbing small stores in nearby states. Police then knew that they were in Dallas, but nobody was willing to give them up. In the poverty-stricken slums, the law was the enemy, and Bonnie and Clyde were their own kind of folk heroes. On November the 22nd, Clyde arranged a family meeting in the ghost town of Sears, 11 miles northwest of Dallas. The spot was chosen for privacy, but an anonymous tip reached the police. When the Barrow family gathered in the field by the highway, officers lay waiting in the brush. Clyde drove up, but something felt wrong. His instincts told him not to stop, and as he rolled past, the sheriff and his deputies burst from hiding and opened fire. Bullets shredded through the car, striking both Bonnie and Clyde in their knees. Somehow they managed to keep going, dumping the wrecked car and stealing another to escape. The family was unharmed, but the ambush made headlines nationwide. The lawmen had failed again. How many bullets could these two take and keep walking? Some papers half-joked that Bonnie and Clyde were protected by voodoo. The sheriff who attacked them, Sheriff Schmid, became the laughingstock of the country. He couldn't even bring down the crippled pair who could barely crawl. That same month, Jones was arrested, and just as Clyde had instructed, he lied. He told police he'd been kidnapped, threatened with death, chained up at night, and begged for protection. I was forced along under threats of death with Clyde Barr through many of his gun battles, and saw him kill 5 men. Clyde Barr never seemed to care for killing anyone, and all he thought of was himself. That's the reason I tried to escape. He just didn't kill me as anyone. The act worked. Instead of the death penalty, the teenager was handed 15 years, practically a slap on the wrist for a murder charge. Clyde later learned in January that Jones had kept his word, and if he played his cards right, he might be out in 10 years. Clyde breathed a sigh of relief, but Eastham still haunted him. Early in 1934, word came from Raymond Hamilton, who was locked away once more at the Bloody Ham farm. Clyde's old prison mate, Ralph Fultz, was there too. Hamilton's message carried everything that Clyde needed to know to hatch a plan. Clyde saw 2 roads ahead. He and Bonnie had already said their goodbyes to their families, and they could either keep running until the bullets finally caught them in a ditch or some old drugstore, or they could go down fighting for something that actually mattered to them, for justice, for revenge, for East. Clyde had always promised he'd burn the prison down, and now fate was calling his bluff. He chose the latter. Bonnie, broken as she was, agreed. The fog clung thick to the flatlands around Eastham Prison Farm on the morning of January the 16th, 1934. It was the kind of gray, heavy air that muffled sound and made every shape blur. Out on the timberline, prisoners hacked at brush and felled trees, watched over by mounted guards with rifles across their saddles. Among them rode Major Joe Krausen, a veteran of the place known for keeping tight order over the squads. Unseen in the low mist, Clyde Barrow crouched in a drainage ditch. A Ford VA, idling just out of earshot. He wasn't there to rob or to run. He was there for revenge. East the bloody Hem farm had brutalized him, starved him, and scarred him. Now he'd come back to tear it open. The plan had been set in motion days earlier. Pistols and ammunition was smuggled onto the farm, hidden in a discarded inner tube buried near the fields. Raymond Hamilton, back inside after his earlier capture, had made sure his work squad was positioned close. He and Joe Palmer, another hardened convict, each took a weapon when the signal came. It happened in a flash. Palmer stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired point-blank into Major Crowson's chest. The officer lurched in the saddle, mortally wounded, but clung to his horse and tried to ride for help. Another guard caught a round in the hip. Shouts erupted, prisoners scattered, some hitting the dirt, others bolting into the fog. From the ditch, Clyde opened up with his trusty bar rifle, spraying, covering shots to pin the guards down. His bullets chewed up the timber and dirt, buying seconds for the men he'd come to free. Hamilton and Palmer sprinted for the rendezvous points, joined by Henry Methvin and Hilton Bybee, who hadn't even been part of the plan, but seized the chaos as their chance at freedom. Aubrey Scally made it a few yards before peeling off, while other convicts dove back towards the guards rather than risk a bullet in the back. Through the smoke and panic, the escapees reached the Ford V8. Clyde slammed the car into gear, mud spitting from the tires as the men crammed into the back. The guards fired wildly, their shots cracking over the roof as the V8 roared away. Behind them, Major Crowson slumped in his saddle. Still alive, but barely. He would linger 10 more days before dying of his wounds. His death made the breakout not just a humiliation, but a killing blow to the reputation of Texas's prison system. By the time the smoke cleared, East's fences had been mocked, its guards outgunned, and the Barrow name splashed across headlines nationwide. 6 men had run out of the bloody Hem farm that morning. Some would be caught and executed. But for Clyde, Bonnie, and the rest of the Barrow gang, the prison break was more than just another notch in their crime spree. It was payback. East had made Clyde Barrow. Now he had struck back at it, and the state of Texas would never forgive him. The East prison break humiliated law enforcement. The press called it a jailbreak worthy of Hollywood, splashing Bonnie and Clyde across the front page as if they were legends. They invented extra deaths, a storm of machine gun fire, and described Clyde's crippled sweetheart as a cigar-chomping outlaw. Fact or fiction didn't matter. What mattered was the image. Bonnie and Clyde, the nation's most famous couple, had just made fools of the nation's toughest prison. Behind the headlines, officials were livid. For years, every state worked on its own, each county sheriff guarding his turf, rarely sharing information. Clyde had taken advantage of that disunity again and again. But East changed the game. Now the Texas prison system wanted someone who could end this farce. So they called Frank Hamer out of retirement. Hamer was no ordinary lawman. A former Texas Ranger, he had spent years bringing down bandits across the state. A man so feared and respected that Hollywood had already turned him into a legend. Hard, quiet, and utterly relentless. Hamer agreed to the job, but only on one condition. When he caught Bonnie and Clyde, he had first pick of whatever was left at the scene. Even then, people knew the outlaw lover's possessions would be relics worth a hell of a lot of money one day. Once Hamer set out, the chase grew merciless. He was never far behind, and the Barrow gang barely had time to breathe. Just a week after the breakout, on January the 23rd, the gang stormed the First National Bank of Rembrandt in Iowa. They marched out with nearly $4,000 in cash. But almost as quickly as the money came, the gang started to splinter. Hilton Bybee took his share and walked away, deciding that Clyde Barrow was too hot to run with. Joe Palmer left soon after, feeling he'd paid his debt for the jailbreak. That left Bonnie, Clyde, Hamilton, and Methvin, and the partnership was toxic. Clyde had taken a shine to Henry Methvin, a quiet Eastham escapee. and Hamilton resented it bitterly. He and Clyde had always butted heads, but now the rivalry was raw. Worse, Clyde insisted every robbery should be split with Bonnie, too, even though she could barely stand, let alone drive or fire a gun. Her ruined left leg had left her dependent on Clyde for everything, but he wouldn't leave her out. To Clyde, Bonnie was his equal no matter what. Hamer's shadow dogged them across state lines. He phoned ahead to sheriffs, set up roadblocks, and called him favors. The moment Clyde switched cars or crossed a county line, another deputy seemed to be waiting. Eyewitnesses who met them during this period remembered them as strangely polite, almost meek, but worn down. The endless nights in the stolen cars, the constant fear, and the relentless pursuit, it wore them all thin. By February, the tension snapped. Hamilton brought along his girlfriend, Mary O'Are, and she proved unbearable. She was spoiled and sharp-tongued, and she complained about everything: the bugs, the cold nights, the canned food, and the endless driving. Newspapers had painted the Barrow gang as glamorous, fast cars, sharp suits, Bonnie in silk dresses with a Tommy gun under her arm. But Mary saw the reality of their situation. A girl with a mangled leg who winced at every step. A man who swore for scraps. A night spent hiding in bushes and hedges rather than grand hotels, and the disillusionment poisoned the air inside the car. On February the 19th, Clyde struck again, remarkably raiding the Texas State Armory and Ranger for a second time. They loaded the trunks with Browning automatics, more rifles, and more ammunition. It was a major score, enough firepower to fight an army, and it was an absolute humiliation once again for law enforcement. But the law was now listening to Hamer. Departments that once ignored each other now cooperated, trusting the Ranger's word. Everywhere the gang went, police tightened the noose. The pressure was so intense that Clyde began to shoot first and ask questions later. On Easter Sunday, April the 1st, 1934, near Grapevine, Texas, he and Methvin encountered two highway patrolmen, E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy. The troopers hadn't even drawn their weapons when Clyde and Methvin gunned them down at point-blank range, and the killings horrified the public. The outlaw lovers, who once seemed like folk heroes, now looked like cold-blooded killers. And Bonnie was devastated. The papers, once so flattering, now painted her as a murderess. They said she smoked cigars and laughed while shooting men down, that she was Clyde's equal in violence. None of it was true. Bonnie had never fired a shot in her life, but the image stuck. Clyde might have accepted being demonized, but Bonnie longed for the glamorous myth. The outlaw queen adored in the newsreels, being cast as a heartless killer, shattered her. Clyde tried to lift her spirits. He even found her a pet rabbit, a little bunny she named Sunny Boy. She doted on him while they drove, but the truth was plain. The gang was crumbling. Hamilton stole more than his share during a robbery, and Clyde, sick of him and his shrill girlfriend, cut him loose. That left only three: Clyde, Bonnie, and Henry Methvin. For Clyde, cutting Hamilton loose felt like a relief, a tighter circle, fewer mouths, fewer complaints. But in reality, it was the worst decision of his life. Quiet, watchful Methvin wasn't just another outlaw. He would be the very reason that the Barrow gang met its bloody end. By the second week of March, Frank Hamer caught a break. Clyde took Henry Methvin to see his family and his father, Ivy, contacted the police the minute he realized who his son was running with. He'd give them the most wanted fugitives in the nation, and in exchange, he wanted his son's immunity. The last time Methvin visited his father, he'd secretly passed a message on to him telling him to organize a deal on his behalf. Just because Bonnie and Clyde had resigned themselves to their eventual deaths didn't mean that Methvin was willing to die alongside them. They were a big enough prize to scrub his record clean. So he took the only option at his disposal. Ivy put the group up in a cabin situated in the wilder parts of his farm, tucked away from the main road alongside Gibbsland in Benville Parish, Louisiana, on Parr Road 300. Hamer brought several retired rangers out of the woodwork to aid him in what was becoming the most infamous manhunt of the century. He had taken the time to learn Clyde Barrow's ways, as if he was shadowing a wild animal. He slept in the same cars Clyde preferred, ate the same food he did, even dressed himself in the same sharp suits that Clyde favored, until he felt he understood the 25-year-old outlaw better than Clyde understood himself. Hamer had identified the rhythm of Clyde's life, his compulsion to visit family every 3 or 4 months like clockwork, the habit of returning to the same campgrounds and safe houses to store weapons, and the unshakable routine of following the same half-moon arc across the Midwest. It was not luck that had kept Bonnie and Clyde alive. Hamer realized it was repetition, and repetition could be predicted. He set his men to wait at the pit stops. He knew the Barrow gang would eventually return to the crossroads where Clyde's beloved Ford V8s had been seen countless times before. Hamer paid particular attention to Methvin's parents' cabin in Benville Parish, Louisiana. Clyde would always circle back. He always did. By April 1934, the sightings began. On the 4th, Clyde and Bonnie were spotted driving through Durant, Oklahoma, down Main Street in broad daylight. A reckless show of defiance. A few days later, they turned up in Commerce, East Oklahoma, where locals saw them armed and alert, making their slow arc back into familiar territory. Hamer marked the dates and watched the map closely. If his calculations were right, they would be in Iowa within days. He was correct. On April the 16th, the gang robbed the First National Bank in Stuart, Iowa, just days after a brutal exchange in Oklahoma, where Constable William Calvin Campbell had been gunned down, and Police Chief Percy Boyd had been shot and left bleeding on a country road near Commerce. Boyd, still alive, was forced into their car as a hostage. For a few tense hours, he rode alongside them while Bonnie fussed over his wound, dressing it and even giving him a fresh shirt to replace his blood-soaked one. Before releasing him, she had one request: tell the newspapers that she didn't smoke cigars. She couldn't abide the image they had painted of her, a cigar-clenching murderess. It was unladylike, she said, and not how she wanted to be remembered. Boyd later told the press that he found her gentle, even doting, and he could not bring himself to believe that she was capable of killing anyone. Still, the bloodletting continued. Hamer's pursuit was draining the pair to exhaustion, and by the time that they returned to Dallas later that month, Emma Parker and Clyde Barrow were horrified. Their children looked 20 years older than they were. Bonnie's leg was twisted and crippled, forcing her to limp permanently. Clyde was gaunt, his face drawn tight, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights and the constant strain of being hunted. Both were little more than ghosts of their former selves. Hamer's traps, the endless flight from the law, and the road itself was breaking them. Yet the pair never guessed that one man was orchestrating their misery. They thought their bad luck was catching up to them, never realizing that a seasoned ranger had charted every step they took. Their families begged them to run south, to vanish into Mexico, to buy a ranch, and hide until the storm passed. They even told them who was behind the tightening net: Frank Hamer, the most successful ranger in the United States, a man who never failed. But Bonnie and Clyde refused. They would not leave their families behind, not even for a chance at survival. That decision sealed their fate. They knew with Frank Hamer breathing down their necks, they only had weeks to live. In those last weeks, both began to prepare for their deaths. Bonnie asked her mother to make sure she was buried back home in Dallas, beside her niece and nephew, Billie Jean's children, who had sadly passed away. Clyde drew up a will and had his father sign it, insisting that he and Bonnie be buried side by side. It was a final act of control, a way to dictate at least one last detail of their doomed story. The gang soon made their way to Benville Parish, Louisiana, playing to lay low at the cabin Ivy Methvin had kept vacant for them. They believed it was safe ground. What they didn't know was that Ivy had already struck a deal with law enforcement. The plan was simple. Henry Methvin would deliberately separate from the gang, forcing Clyde to come looking for him at his parents' cabin. There was only one road leading there, a rural stretch of Route 154, known locally as Par Road 300. If Clyde came, he would have to drive down that narrow highway straight into Hamer's waiting guns. Hamer gathered 6 of his most trusted men, all armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols, hidden in thick brush along the roadside, and they began their stakeout on May the 21st. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with insects, but they waited without complaint. They knew who was coming. On the morning of May the 23rd, just after 9 o'clock a.m., Clyde's gray Ford V8 appeared on the road, rolling lazily out of the bend. Clyde was at the wheel, wearing a blue shirt, black hat, and a sharp tailored suit. Bonnie sat beside him in a vibrant red dress, nibbling on a sandwich for breakfast. Ahead of them, staged as planned, Ivy Methvin's truck was pulled partly onto the shoulder, its hood up as if he had broken down. Clyde slowed, preparing to stop and offer a helping hand. What happened next was chaos. The plan had been to wait, to give Clyde the chance to step out, to perhaps even surrender, and to spare Bonnie, if possible. But their nerves snapped. Believing Clyde possessed some kind of uncanny look, or fearing he might reach for a weapon, one of the Rangers fired the first shot. His bullet tore through the windshield and straight into Clyde's temple, and Clyde died instantly. His head snapped sideways and his foot jerked on the accelerator. The V8 lurched forward into the ditch as Bonnie screamed. The sudden movement convinced the rest of the posse that the couple was trying to escape. They didn't know that Clyde was dead. All 6 opened fire at once. The sound was deafening. Rifles, shotguns, and pistols poured over 150 rounds into the car. Glass shattered, metal shrieked, and smoke filled the morning air. Bonnie's screams carried above the gunfire for several seconds, then faded into silence. When the guns went quiet, the Ford V8 sat riddled with holes, its chrome dulled by smoke and blood. Clyde was slumped, dead at the wheel. Bonnie was beside him, her red dress soaked dark. She had been hit 26 times. Clyde had taken 18 bullets. Bonnie still clutched her half-eaten sandwich in her hand, her head fallen against Clyde's shoulder, resting there even in death. Still Hamer approached cautiously. He walked up to the car and fired again into the lifeless bodies, unwilling to risk even the slightest chance that they might still draw breath. Only when he was certain they were dead did he lower his gun. The 6 lawmen wasted no time ransacking the car. Clyde's saxophone, Bonnie's poetry, their weapons, even small personal trinkets, were taken. A suitcase stuffed with $18,000 in cash mysteriously vanished before the coroner ever saw the scene. Then, as if the slaughter itself wasn't grotesque enough, the scavengers descended. Locals flooded the road, hacking at the corpses for souvenirs. Men and women cut locks of Bonnie's hair, tore pieces from her red dress, and ripped Clyde's bullet rid. One man even tried to saw off Clyde's trigger finger. The car was dragged into town, stopping at a middle school along the way, so that children could run out to gawk at the bodies and poke at them like a carnival attraction. By the time their corpses reached Conger's furniture store and funeral parlor on Railroad Avenue in Arcadia, Louisiana, the famous outlaws were almost stripped bare. Bonnie had scarcely a hair left on her head, and her dress was cut to ribbons. A crowd of 20,000 people gathered outside, camping in the streets for the chance to see the corpses of America's most notorious lovers. Each and every officer present at the time of the capture deserves the same credit as we all did our best. I regret that we couldn't have taken them alive, but that was impossible. I further regret that there was a woman that had to be killed, which couldn't have been helped. There's not much to say now. It is all over. The ends of law and justice have been served. Bonnie Parker was buried at Crown Hill Memorial Park in Dallas, beside her niece and nephew. She was 23 years old. Clyde Barrow was laid to rest at Western Heights Cemetery on Fort Worth Avenue beside his brother Book. He had turned 25 just 2 months earlier. His wish to be buried beside Bonnie was denied. In death, they were revealed for what they truly were, Not immortal figures, not glamorous Robin Hoods, but two broken young people cut down in their prime. Bonnie was a full-blown alcoholic, her body scarred and twisted by injury. Clyde the same, although he got his vengeance on Eastham, the prison that he had once sworn to burn to the ground. Together they had killed 13 people, stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, and abandoned more than 100 stolen cars, riddled with as many bullets as their own bodies would later take. Their story ended not in glory, but in a ditch outside Gibbsland, Louisiana, with gunsome smoke hanging in the air and the last crumbs of a sandwich in Bonnie Parker's hand. Thanks so much for watching. Please like the video and consider subscribing if you enjoyed it. And please feel free to join my Discord if you want to get involved in the discussion where we discuss these stories in more detail. And it's a place where you'll get a chance to vote on future videos and much, much more. It's completely free of charge, and basically, it's an app that's really easy to use. I'll leave a link in a pinned comment if that sounds of interest to yourself, and hope to see you there. If not, that's absolutely fine.